Good morning. We're allowing people to trickle in and settle down. And welcome to Two Rivers Unitarian Universalist Community. My name is Rob Benedetti, and I will be serving as worship associate today, along with Sue Lavin, who we are welcoming to our worship team. Sue has an extensive history in the theater, and I'm sure she's going to bring a lot of knowledge and skill to our team. We are delighted also to have Aaron Brown joining us today in the pulpit. Our worship theme for this month is imagination. Two Rivers Unitarian Universalist is a welcoming community. We are glad that you have joined us today. If you are new to Unitarian Universalism and wondering what it all means, the historical organizing principle of Unitarianism 400 years ago was the unity of God, not the Trinity. The historical organizing principle of Universalism 200 years ago was the goodness of God, not the judgment of God. Unitarian, God is one. Universalism, God is love. Over the centuries, we have evolved into a religion that has no creed. Each person is free to believe what they find to be true. If we have any guests who feel comfortable introducing themselves or being introduced, we invite you to do so now. And if you prefer sit quietly, please know that we are glad that you are here. Hi, Larry. Oh, welcome, Scott. Welcome. Anyone else? Nope. Okay. Oh, Paul.
I'd like to introduce our guest musician today. Dean is a nurse at Valley View and also a fantastic musician, and he's subbing for Micha while Micha is in Germany. So we're glad to have Dean here today.
Welcome and thank you, Dean. Yes. Aaron, welcome. Terry. Oh, welcome. Bienvenidos. Okay, and we invite everyone to join us after the service for coffee and lively discussion. If you would like to connect to our community, please leave contact information on the back of the order of service. We also invite those with pastoral and caring committee concerns to use the back of the order of service as well. You can put those in the offering basket or on the table by the door. I want to express our gratitude to Ian Hess and Sue Lavin for serving as setup hosts, and to Dee Dee and Ed. Where are Dee Dee and Ed? They're back there, okay. Dee Dee and Ed, our coffee hour hosts. And thank you to our musicians, Paul Dankers and Dean Gattro. Did I say your name right? Close enough, okay. Okay. And much gratitude to Andrew Ferrier for shepherding those joining us remotely via Zoom and YouTube. I invite your attention to the announcements in your order of service, and I'd like to highlight one specific item. We are hosting an all-congregational potluck at the 3rd Street Center in this room on May the 17th at 5:30. We will have some surprise entertainment, and we are going to try something new in terms of fundraising. We will have a paddle raise at our congregational dinner to try and replace the soundboard that is Paul Dankers, and he has to schlep it around all the time. And we're going to try to raise some money to buy our own soundboard, as Paul and Micha have really raised the bar of the technology that we are now able to provide. So we're trying to support that. and we will be doing that with a paddle raise at the all-congregational dinner. So thank you, Paul, for donating that to us for all this time. Now Nikki Delson has an announcement that she would like to proffer.
Maybe you want to use this microphone here because we don't have one in the pulpit.
Okay.
I just want to make a brief announcement that came from the fire department this season about the extreme fire danger in Carbondale. We are the hot spot for the valley. So I'm not going to make an announcement about what the issues are. I'm going to tell you about this handout that I have. I want to encourage everybody to scan this and to register for ReachWell and for Community Connect. ReachWell will give you on your smartphone alerts for whatever you sign up for. So everybody should sign up for Pitkin, Garfield, and Eagle County alerts if there's fire danger there or if there are road closures in case we do an evacuation. And Community Connect is important if you know somebody that will need help during a time of evacuation, or if you have pets at home. So it allows you to register the pet in case you're able to evacuate, you're not home, but your pet is still home. I'm going to stay after the meeting and help anybody that wants to register this on your smartphone. Okay, so imagine, we're imagining, that we're all going to be safe this fire season.
Thank you, Nikki. Yes?
I have an announcement to those who don't know. Today, from 2 to 4, there's a Democratic rally in RVR in the restaurant, Homestead.
Oh, good.
They still have some tickets available.
Okay. Thank you, Jude. Yes, Larry.
I've been asked to make not an announcement, but an encouragement to people to participate in our circle suppers. Because there are a lot of new faces here. It's great. And it may be that some people are not familiar with circle suppers. So briefly, they are volunteer, potluck kinds of things where you gather 6 to 8 or maybe 10 people to your home on the date that you specify, and we work with you in terms of coordinating this whole thing, and they're really, really nice. So there's a note in the handout, and if you learn more about it, be here.
Thank you, Larry, for all you've done to keep this Circle Suppers program active and alive. Okay, please know that we will remain seated throughout the service so that everyone can see the slides. Now please silence your phones, watches, and the like as we move into worship with a musical prelude by Dean and Paul.
This might be a pool like I've read of in books, connected to one of those underground brooks, an underground river that starts here and flows right under the bathtub, and then, who knows, it's possible, anything's possible. It might go along down where no one can see, right under State Highway 203. Right under the wagon, right under the toes of Mrs. Ambroso, who's hanging out clothes. It's possible, anything's possible. This might be a river, now mightn't it be, connecting McGilligan's pool with the sea? Then maybe some fish might be swimming toward me. in McElligot's pool. It's possible. Anything's possible. It's possible. Anything's possible. It's possible. Anything's possible.
Thank you. Our chalice lighting today comes from the words of J.K. Rowling from a piece entitled Good Lives, Fringe Benefits of Failure and the Importance of Imagination. Imagination is not only the uniquely human capacity to envision that which is not, and therefore the font of all invention and innovation. In its arguably most transformative and revelatory capacity, it is the power that enables us to empathize with humans whose experiences we have never shared. Please remain seated for our opening hymn. Every Woman in the World. Please join me in our spoken unison covenant, followed by our song aspiration. Love is the spirit of this community, and service is its law. This is our covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another.
Good morning. Happy May 4th. May the 4th be with you. I think it always sounds a little strange to feel like I have a lisp when I'm saying that. I'm delighted to be with you all on this beautiful morning. Thank you for choosing to spend this time. I'm going to start with a place that Mika and Paul and Dean have started us on already with that opening song from McElligot's Pool, a story that was incorporated into Seussical the Musical. One funny note, my son Ori was due to be in that musical right before COVID hit, and so I had to lose that, which would have been something he was very much looking forward to. So it always has an interesting place in my heart for that. As does this book. So I'm going to be reading little clips from this, your favorite Seuss book. And I don't know if you can tell how worn this book is, but I will say that some of my absolute highlights of my life came during a time of my life when I felt so deeply unfinished, unsettled, unrealized in so many ways professionally. I was so, I would say, even disturbed by day that I was not doing enough, becoming enough to really shine for my family the way that I wanted to have the professional accomplishment, the intellectual accomplishment that I hoped for. But at the end of each day, when I would get into the room with my children, my two, at the time, little girls, and they would come onto my lap, and I would hold them there, and we would start opening the storybooks that we would read together, I was in a peak experience every one of those nights. Such an extraordinary opportunity that it's funny the contrast between the disappointment that I would pile on myself in the day and the elation that I would feel at night, that even in that I couldn't realize how much I had everything I could ever want in my arms at that moment. If there are any parents here who had similar experiences, perhaps you can recognize just the preciousness of that time. So these were some of the stories that we would read. I want to give you excerpts from two of them in particular. So there is, and to think that I saw it on Mulberry Street. This was Dr. Seuss's first published children's book. He wrote it in 1937, or I think both wrote and published. It came out relatively close. It was rejected 20 to 40 times, and he almost gave up entirely, except that he was walking home one day and ran into an old friend from Dartmouth, and this friend happened to have connections in publishing and got him connected at the exact moment that he was about to give up, which I find fascinating. But I want to read this one to you because it stars a little boy named Marco, who is the same Marco we'll hear about in McElligot's Pool in a moment. It begins, "When I leave home to walk to school, Dad always says to me, 'Marco, keep your eyelids up and see what you can see.' But when I tell him where I've been and what I think I've seen, he looks at me and sternly says, 'Your eyesight's much too keen. Stop telling such outlandish tales. Stop turning minnows into whales.' Now what can I say when I get home today? All the long way to school and all the way back, I've looked, and I've kept careful track, but all that I've noticed except my own feet was a horse and a wagon on Mulberry Street. That's nothing to tell of. That won't do, of course. Just a broken down wagon that's drawn by a horse. That can't be my story. That's only a start. I'll say that a zebra was pulling that cart, and that is a story that no one can beat when I say that I saw it on Mulberry Street. Yes, the zebra is fine, but I think it's a shame, such a marvelous beast with a cart that's so tame. The story would really be better to hear if the driver I saw were a charioteer. A gold and blue chariot's something to meet, rumbling like thunder down Mulberry Street." Now the story goes on and on through a gradual expansion until there is this giant glorious parade, which you might not be able to see from back there. He says toward the end, "With the roar of its motor, an airplane appears and dumps out confetti while everyone cheers." And that makes a story that's really not bad, But it still could be better. Suppose that I add a Chinese man who eats with sticks, a big magician doing tricks, a 10-foot beard that needs a comb. No time for more. I'm almost home. I swung round the corner and dashed through the gate. I ran up the steps and I felt simply great, for I had a story that no one could beat. And to think that I saw it on Mulberry Street. But Dad said quite calmly, just draw up your stool and tell me the sights on the way home from school. There was so much to tell, I just couldn't begin. Dad looked at me sharply and pulled at his chin. He frowned at me sternly from there in his seat. Was there nothing to look at, no people to greet? Did nothing excite you or make your heart beat? Nothing, I said, growing red as a beet, but a plain horse and wagon on Mulberry Street. So this is written in 1937. Dr. Seuss, Theodore Geisel, has already made kind of a small fortune creating all of his funny creatures and ads, particularly one for, I think, a pesticide called Flit, and that became part of the collective consciousness of the time. And then, so, this whole idea of children's books, though, sort of went away a little bit as he got amped up for dealing with the fact that the world went into war, and he became part of the propaganda arm and tried to help inspire the troops and inspire the people in the country to do what he felt was best. And then finally the war ended. And I think it's such an interesting reflection that in this moment we see human imagination in some pretty extraordinary ways, because obviously that war introduced us to Nazi death camps, an imagination of what can happen when we allow our hate to consume us. It introduced us to atomic weapons as well as atomic power. Everyone in this room has come into being in a world that could be seemingly vaporized by men with these powerful tools that our imagination has given. What a cost to grow up in a world that feels like it could be eliminated at the touch of a button because of the power of our imagination. So then, at the other end of the war, Dr. Seuss goes back to writing children's books, and he comes back to Marco. And you heard some of these words before, but I'll read them again. This is McElligot's Pool. Young man, laughed the farmer, you're sort of a fool. You'll never catch fish in McElligot's Pool. The pool is too small, and you might as well know it. When people have junk, here's the place that they throw it. You might catch a boot, or you might catch a can, you might catch a bottle, but listen, young man, if you sat 50 years with your worms and your wishes, you'd grow a long beard long before you'd catch fishes. Answered Marco. It may be you're right. I've been here 3 hours without one single bite. There might be no fish, but again, well, there might. 'Cause you never can tell what goes on down below. This pool might be bigger than you or I know. This might be a pool like I've read of in books, connected to one of those underground brooks, an underground river that starts here and flows right under the pasture, and then, well, who knows? It might go along down where no one can see, right under State Highway 203, right under the wagons, right under the toes of Mrs. Umbroso, who's hanging out clothes. It might keep on flowing, perhaps, who can tell, right under the people in Steedens Hotel, right under the grass where they're playing croquet, then under the mountains and far, far away. This might be a river now, mightn't it be, connecting McElligot's Pool with the sea. Then maybe some fish might be swimming toward me. If such a thing could be, then certainly they would be. Some very smart fellow might point out the way to the place where I'm fishing, and that's why I say if I wait long enough, if I'm patient and cool, who knows what I'll catch in McElligot's Pool. I might catch a thin fish, I might catch a stout fish, I might catch a short or a long, long drawn-out fish. You might catch that paper. and then he goes on. There's fishes with pinwheel-like tails, and fishes with fins like sails, and seahorses and sea cows, and eels and whales and mackerels and trouts and fast-moving blokes who swim through the air with overhand strokes. Whales. We even get, then there is something bigger than a whale, some sort of a kind of a thingamajigger, a fish that's so big, if you know what I mean, that he makes a whale look like a tiny sardine. Oh, the sea is so full of a number of fish. If a fellow is patient, he might get his wish. And that's why I think that I'm not such a fool when I sit here and fish in McElligot's pool. Now note the interesting transition that those 10 years wrought from succumbing to his father's limits on imagination to telling that farmer, no, I'll sit here with my imagination. And then, of course, the rest of the story of Dr. Seuss is that he goes on to write over 60 children's books that become the template upon which many young imaginations are formed, one filled with endless possibility of what could be. And yet still there is this interesting tension. And it brings us the question for the day that I just want to invite all of us to sit with. And it's a question that I would say is a dual question. The question is, what shall we make of imagination? And I say it's a dual question because part of it is, what shall we make of it? What shall we think of this thing that gives us Dr. Seuss and atom bombs? And also, what shall we do with this thing that gives us Dr. Seuss and atom bombs? What shall we make of it? What are you making of it? What power does this have? Whether for a boy sitting by a pool that obviously has nothing but cans and old shoes in it, and yet produces in him a vision of tremendous possibilities. A power that in our stubbornness can be contorted into, I don't know, some guy who loses his job, loses every bit and base of his power, throws a giant fit and tries to burn the whole place down, gets deplatformed, gets exiled, and somehow imagines a way back and finds it. Consistently imagines. There's a fascinating Atlantic article about this guy who lost his job in the most recent issue, and it really credits the power of one of the most amazing political comebacks in history to pure imagination. He never believed he lost. He never believed he shouldn't be in power. And somehow enough other people came along for the ride. And now he's imagining that he should be Pope. I don't know if any of you saw his recent social media postings, AI-generated images of this particular man who once lost his job in the Pope's robes. It's amazing. What an interesting, fierce imagination. What power in imagination. What do we make of imagination? With that, let's move into a little bit of contemplation and prayer. Some of us might be feeling unsettled by that. I'm a little unsettled even thinking about it. It's unsettling. It is unsettling, this power. And we'll continue to explore it through our time, but now I just want to invite you to use the power of your imagination to bring to mind and heart that which you love, that which you want more of in this world. Let the possibilities stir in you. And if some of that involves love and care and kindness for someone or someones, please take this time to speak their names aloud or even just hold them in your heart so that the joy and love of this congregation can be projected toward them as well. All right, and I will now just invite you as we get a little instrumental music to just breathe into some calmness. There are great forces at work. We have more power than we can imagine in our imagination. And let's simply try to allow it to unfold and to move us along with this music into a state of imagining what could truly be possible in a world of endless possibility.
One of the things I like most about being a worship associate in this congregation is exposing myself to new ideas. As I was preparing for the reading today, I was searching the Unitarian Universalist Association's worship website for a reading on imagination, and up popped this. It's a reading from someone I had never heard of before named Valerie Kaur, K-A-U-R. And if you want to be inspired, Google her and watch some of her YouTube presentations. But this reading is taken from a speech that she gave on December 31st, 2016, which you'll recognize as just after we had had an election that traumatized us all. And she gave it to the National Moral Revival Poor People's Campaign Night Watch Service. And it's entitled, Breathe, Then Push. Valerie Kaur's grandfather came to America in 1913, and because he looked different and wore a turban, they threw him behind bars where he languished for months before a white lawyer filed a writ of habeas corpus and he was released. He became a farmer free to practice his Sikh faith, love and oneness, which sounds a little bit to me like Unitarian Universalism. But 30 years later, when his Japanese American neighbors were rounded up and taken to their own detention camps, he went out to see them and he looked after their farms until they returned home. He refused to stand down. This inspired his granddaughter to become a lawyer, like the man who freed her grandfather, and she joined a generation of activists fighting detentions and deportation, hate crimes, and racial profiling. She closed this speech with this: "Yes, Rabbi, the future is dark. On this New Year's Eve, this watch night, I close my eyes and I see the darkness of my grandfather's cell. And I can feel the spirit of ever-rising optimism in the Sikh tradition, Chardi Kala, within him. And so the mother in me asks, what if? What if this darkness is not the darkness of the tomb, but the darkness of the womb? What if our America is not dead, but a country waiting to be born? What if the story of America is one long labor? What if all our grandfathers and grandmothers are standing behind us now? Those who survived occupation and genocide, slavery and Jim Crow, detentions and political assault. What if they are whispering in our ear tonight, "You are brave"? What if this is our nation's great transition? What does the midwife tell us to do? Breathe, then push. Because if we don't push, we will die. If we don't push, now our nation will die. Tonight we will breathe. Tomorrow we will labor. And love, your revolutionary love, is the magic we will show our children.
To dream the impossible dream, to fight the unbeatable foe, to bear with unbearable sorrow, to run where the brave dare not go, to right the unrightable wrong, to love pure and chaste from afar, to try when your arms are too weary to reach the unreachable star. This is my quest, to follow that star, no matter how hopeless, no matter how far, to fight for the right without question or pause, to be willing to march into hell for a heavenly cause. And I know if I'll only be true to this glorious quest, that my heart will lie peaceful and calm when I'm laid to my rest. And the world will be better for this, that one man, scorned and covered with scars, still strove with his last ounce of courage to fight the unbeatable foe, to reach the unreachable star. Many of you might recognize that from Man of La Mancha. I even saw some of you voicing it along with me. It's powerful. I want to sit with it for a moment. So just a little bit of setting. So my son, Ori, we launched him to college in California a couple of years ago. At the time, my ex and I were both working, and we had not saved as much as we hoped, but we were both working. Well, we had not saved. Let me just say that. We were both working, though, and we had some strong income coming in, so we sent him to a college that cost $60,000 a year. And at the end of that year, only one of us was still working, and because one of us had not seen to our savings as much as others of us might have wished one of us had, we were in a tough position, and Ori ultimately withdrew from school because when we were looking at school loans and the fact that they are charging 9.5% to 10% for these loans, we were saying $60,000 a year, so basically that $180,000 will become about $400,000 by the time you pay it all off. He wanted to be an actor, he wanted to be in the theater. And so if we sent him to school to figure out how to be in the theater, he could never afford to ever act again. It was painful for him to leave school, and it was painful for me imagining what he was going through, believing, feeling in my heart, not just his pain, but my pain at not being a better provider for my son. So anyway, this year we have been doing a lot of figuring and refiguring, and because he did so extraordinarily well in school, he is able to attend Utah universities at almost no cost. And so we went on a college tour a few weeks ago, and we looked at Southern Utah University and Utah Tech, which are in the south part of the state. He wanted a little more warmth than we typically get. And each night we went to a different play. We hadn't known or planned that that would happen. The second day that we were there, the second travel day, we saw Man of La Mancha. It was playing at the local community theater. We got online, saw that it was playing, went over to the theater right after our college tour, and they had 2 tickets left. We got the 2 tickets, and we got to watch this wonderful show, and it's this fascinating exploration of justice and imagination. For those who don't know or don't remember, this is the story of Don Quixote, but they take the author, Miguel Cervantes, and they show him at a time where he is being put into prison awaiting the Inquisition because he decided that he should try to tax the church in the same way that he was taxing everyone else, to apply equal justice as he saw it. And the church got very upset about that, and they tossed him in jail, where he then meets this bunch of other criminals, hardened criminals, who are also there to be tried or found guilty without trial. And they hold their own trial to try and take his stuff. And they tell him, the prisoners tell Cervantes that he is being charged with being 3 things. Number 1, an idealist, because of what he did with the church. But I want you to hang on to that a little bit, an idealist. Remember the stories earlier. What to make of idealists? Do we like him? Do we fear him? Both. He's charged with being an idealist. He's charged with being a bad poet. And he is charged with being an honest man. And they put him to the test. And again, the point of this is he is a man with some wealth. He's come in with some possessions. And the thought of the fellow criminals in the cells is they're just going to find him guilty and take these possessions from him. And he decides to play the game with them, to allow himself to be on this trial, and in fact to plead guilty. Although he has a little trouble with the bad poet part, he accepts that he is an idealist and an honest man. And his defense is to play out Don Quixote, to involve everyone in a play within a play, to explore the life of a dreamer, of another idealist, who interestingly is the opposite, perhaps, of an honest man. Someone who imagines that windmills are giants that can be fought with, a man who has read so many fantasies and romance novels that his brain is infected and he just goes out to try to be a knight in the world. That song, To Dream the Impossible Dream, is one of the songs that he sings in the show. He scoops up his friend who turns into his page and brings him along on this journey. And he also falls in love with an innkeeper girl, a tavern girl. And I say girl because there's a dismissive sense that this woman is another thing we might say is a tavern wench, that she is a serving girl with no hope in her life. Her destiny is in the hands of the men who routinely take advantage of her. But he calls her his Dulcinea, and he lifts her up, and she gets hopeful. But then in her hopefulness, she is led back into a state of a horrible crime committed against her by some of the men in this bar. And it's implied that part of it is she gave in to his hope and was terribly hurt by that. And so the play, as it unfolds, shows us that there is a cost to idealism, to believing in these impossible dreams, that the world might come back and hurt us when we do. And yet it ends on a somewhat hopeful note that this tavern wench, this Dulcinea, and the friend of Don Quixote's come to visit him at his bedside as he's dying. He passes, but they still commit to the imagination of being in a different world. So powerful sort of play about imagination. The night before, we had been at SUU and we saw a play that the students were doing. Again, didn't know this was coming, but it was called Anastasia, the Anastasia Trials in the Court of Women. I don't know if anyone familiar with this one? So it's pretty fascinating. It's a play within a play about justice. And in this play, the Emma Goldman Theater is the fantastical collection of and by fantastical I just mean made-up collection of actresses in this play who, the way that they work is they want to be completely equal, and so each night they draw from a hat to see what role they're going to play. Everyone knows how to play every role. And so the opening of this play that we saw is these women, these actresses, competing and undercutting each other and doing all kinds of kind of naughty, nasty things to each other to get the parts they want. And then we go into the play itself, which is this exploration of a question. And every woman in the audience is given a paddle to vote green or red, whether or not they agree with or disagree with motions made by the courtroom players, these women playing these parts, and ultimately to make a final judgment. The case involves Anastasia, a woman who theoretically escaped from the Russian Revolution and all of its idealist trauma that it inflicted on the Tsar and his family. This is supposedly the youngest daughter of the family. She escapes from Russia and is found in an insane asylum, claiming she's Anastasia. A lot of people don't believe her. That's why she's in the asylum. But there are 5 women represented in this play who knew that she really was Anastasia, but didn't stand up for her enough for various reasons. And they're on trial. And the trial is this rather fascinating experience about recognizing how many intersectional ways we construct our idea of what justice should be. Because these women are being tried for not supporting a fellow woman. But each one of these women is, by being on trial, is not being supported in themselves. They say the reason that they didn't support her is they needed their job. They cared for their partner who needed them to say a certain thing. They were worried about their own capacity to show up in the society. They needed something from her. Each of these women had her own identity that she was desperate to protect. And that's why they didn't necessarily endorse the identity of this other woman who was suffering. And the question is brought to us, what do we make of that? What's justice? What do we need to do with each other? What do we owe to each other? Not only as women, but really as all humans, to take care of and support those who are suffering from the systems we've built, because it's very much an attack on the systems as a whole, on patriarchy, on the violence that comes out of idealistic revolutions. So I was watching this. I was there with my son, who didn't take a paddle despite being of the biological birth gender that could have had one, thinking about categories, thinking about identity structures, what they mean, how we have built this entire structure of definition of what we should be and how we should be, and how punishing it is to all of us, because that's where the women in this play get to, is we're all culpable and we are all innocent. To me, that is what Man of La Mancha is about as well. We are all culpable of having imagination, of dreaming great things, and we're also all innocent. We just want to find the best. We just want to take care of ourselves and each other. And we're doing it in a world that feels impossible to work within sometimes, because of the categories, the judgments, the harshness, the cruelty that we inflict on ourselves because of our imaginations about what should and shouldn't be. So how do we reconcile this? What do we do with it? Well, I want to propose that we do not live in a world. We live in a multiverse. Every one of us is living inside a world. And that world is constructed by our own experience, our own pain, our own judgments, our own needs, and very much that structure of judgments holds us in place such that we are trying to imagine together a world where we feel with each other and we play with each other and we join each other's games. And the way that we join each other's games is to take on each other's pain sometimes, to take on each other's fantasies, to take on each other's possibilities. And some of them fit and some of them don't. Some of them cause deep harm and some of them are liberating. What to make of this? I want to share with you as a final thing some brilliant words from an extraordinary story. This is the book called Why Fish Don't Exist. It's by Lulu Miller. We started talking about a lot of fancy fish. This book destroys fish. You might say, wait, what? I feel like I know that fish exist. But let me just ask a quick question. If you had to say which of the three is not like the other, and I told you that one is a salmon, one is a lungfish, and one is a cow, which would you think doesn't belong with the others? Probably the cow. But in fact, biologists are saying increasingly with ironclad logic that actually the salmon is the one that doesn't belong, because the lungfish and the cow look very identical inside. She gives an example. She talks about the way that the science has emerged on this. She talks about it would be as though we had made up a category called Mish for anyone who lives in the mountains. And by anyone, humans, rabbits, eagles, on and on and on. You could imagine everything that lives in the mountains. We call them all Mish because they happen to live in the mountains. Now she adds, and maybe over time, because they're all up there, they develop a similar kind of skin, a similar kind of armor to deal with the hot sun or something, and that would make them look more similar on the outside. But again, the differences are still there between the eagle and the man and the fox and the coyote and all the rest. So anyway, the idea is that biologists have come along and said the catalog of fish, the whole way we have catalogs, is wrong because we don't actually pay attention to what's inside these creatures when we put them into these taxonomies. Now, that's not really the point of this story. The point of this story is to explore the life of someone that I think is really important for all of us to consider right now. His name was David Starr Jordan. He was the first president of Stanford. He was, like Marco, and like maybe a certain person in the White House today, someone capable of profound imagination, of wanting to see the world exactly as he needed it to be. He got caught up in taxonomy and is one of the people responsible for the classification of, I think, a quarter of our fish species. Lulu Miller was initially attracted to him because his collection kept getting destroyed. There was a lightning strike, there was a fire, and then finally the 1906 San Francisco earthquake destroyed his whole collection of fish. And what he did in response to that, because he could not accept that what was happening would destroy him, what he did in response to that was he went into his lab and he found these fish on the floor with the ethanol everywhere and the broken glass, and he started sewing the names that he had given to these fish that had once been on the outside of the bottle, sewing them to the fish. And she was so moved by that image when she heard it as this defense against chaos and destruction that she was inspired by him. But the more she learned about him, she learned that his whole life had been built around this taxonomy. He'd been inspired by a mentor who said that naming fish was really powerful because naming all of God's creatures got you closer to God. This man also felt like there were moral lessons to learn, that there's some of those creatures that show you how bad you can become if you're just a parasite, or if you're just some of these fish that are bottom feeders. And so this man, Louis Agassiz, had this whole hierarchy. And that hierarchy became absolutely fundamental to David Starr Jordan, who desperately needed to be accomplished and to be loved, and found his way into running Stanford. But when he ran into Jane Stanford, who was the wife of the deceased founder, he got into arguments with her, and he couldn't stand that she was potentially threatening his position, and it's very possible he murdered her. And we hear about that in this story. But not only that, he was one of the primary proponents of eugenics in our culture. There are thousands, tens of thousands of people who are forcibly sterilized, in part because of the work that man, David Starr Jordan, did to say, we can't disrupt our gene pool. We can't backslide. We can't go down. We have to become the greatest thing we can be, and genetics is the way to control all of it. Again, he projected that imagination in the world and caused tremendous harm. So that is what Lulu Miller is trying to reconcile. It's like, how do I deal with this man? What is justice in a world where this man he got away with murder, he got away with eugenics, he died as something of a hero, and it's because he just believed so strongly in this idea that we could classify and make a ladder out of things. And then along comes this whole science that says actually fish don't exist, that his whole catalog, his whole process was kind of a sham. There's 2 sections I want to read and just leave them with you to reflect on as we think about the way we create our worlds and what we have to do with what comes next. And we'll pick all this up next week in more depth as well. So she has just learned all of this about fish not existing. She's going home to her partner, and she's worrying that it's meaningless, everything that she's dealing with here. So one night after Heather, her partner, got home from work, I decided to talk to her about it. She had become non-consensually well-versed in the topic due to my infatuation with it. I let her take off her coat and get settled on the couch. Then I brought out a spread of wine and cheese and asked the thing I feared, do you think any of this matters? Any of the work she has done, researching all of this, any of this matters? And Heather looked at me aghast. Of course it matters, she said. She brought up, of all people, Copernicus. She spoke about how hard it must have been for people in his day to look up at the stars and fathom that the stars were not the ones moving. But still it mattered to talk about it, to think about it, to do the mental scrunching that allowed oneself to slowly let go of the idea of the stars as a celestial ceiling that rotated over one's head each night. Because, as she said, when you give up the stars, you get a universe. So what happens when you give up the fish? I had no idea, but I knew in that moment that was it. That waiting on the other side of the fish was something else. That letting go of the fish would result in some sort of existential exchange. And I figured the result would be different for everyone, just as it had been with the stars. For some, the letting go of the stars was horrifying. It made them feel too small, too pointless, too out of control. They would not believe it. They shot the messengers. When Copernicus gave up the stars, he was condemned as a heretic. When Giordano Bruno gave up the stars, he was burned at the stake. When Galileo gave up the stars, he was placed under house arrest. But for others, it inspired ambition, invention, engineering. Generations of humans would grow up hell-bent on figuring out how to launch ships to the other side of intuition. Their wildest dreams are why we can now lay hands upon the moon. And then she keeps thinking about this, keeps working on this. Like, what does it mean to give up the fish? She had been attracted to David Starr Jordan because as a child, her father had told her life is meaningless. He was a scientist, and he said, we're just a speck on a speck on a speck. And you get to make up your own meaning. And that was too hard for her to hold on to for a long time. It felt impossible. She's referring back to David Starr Jordan and his wild, positive delusions that theoretically gave him a successful career, even if maybe he was miserable throughout it, always hoping for something more than he could ever have, probably never satisfied from what we could tell. Scientists have discovered it's true that employing positive illusions will help you achieve your goals, but I've slowly come to believe that far better things await outside of the tunnel vision of your goals. When I give up the fish, I get a skeleton key, a fish-shaped skeleton key that pops the grid of rules off this world and lets you step through to a wilder place, the other world within this one. The gridless place out the window where fish don't exist and diamonds rain from the sky and each and every dandelion is reverberating with possibility. To turn the key, all you have to do is stay wary of words. If fish don't exist, what else do we have wrong? Slow dawning for me, a scientist's daughter, but when I give up the fish, I realize that science itself is flawed. Not the beacon toward truth I had always thought it was, but a blunt tool that can wreak a lot of havoc along the way. Consider the word order itself. It comes from the Latin ordinem, to describe a row of threads sitting neatly in a loom. In time, it was extended as a metaphor to describe the way that people sit neatly under the rule of a king, general, or president. It was only applied to nature in the 1700s under the assumption, a human fabrication, a superimposition, a guess, that there is an orderly set of ranks to find out there. I have come to believe that it is our life's work to tear down this order, to keep tugging at it, trying to unravel it, to set free the organisms trapped underneath. That is our life's work, that it is our life's work to mistrust our measures, especially those about moral and mental standing. To remember that behind every ruler there is a ruler. To remember that a category is at best a proxy, at worst a shackle. Shortly after I first typed these words, white supremacists will descend on the town where we live, Charlottesville, Virginia. They will park in front of our house, their wheels kissing the gravel of our driveway. They will storm the park with their swastika shields and their fashionable haircuts to defend a statue of a Confederate leader. They will plow a car over a crowd of protesters, killing one and injuring dozens, and beat a black man bloody with their boots and their boards and their beliefs. After it's all over, their leader will take to the radio. He will express regret for the loss of life, but not the idea. The idea that certain races are higher than others, that white is better than black. It is just a matter of science, he will chuckle, a shrug in his tone. This latter, it is still alive. This latter, it is a dangerous fiction. Fish don't exist. A fish-shaped sledgehammer to split it down. So what I want to leave you with this morning is an awareness of categories. Just pay attention to the categories and judgments in your own mind as you go about interacting with all the other worlds out there. Because you are the center of the world, they are the center of the world. We are all in this rich mystery of interacting together. How can we do it best? How can we come together with a state of imagining that allows all of us to be what we are, to become what we are, without circumscribing us in the categories that we think initially? I was reflecting on what it's like to fall in love recently. And think about the power of that. When we're falling in love, some say, well, it's just the chemicals going haywire. But think about it. You're meeting a person who's a mystery to you. And you allow them to remain a mystery, and you discover their mystery. And then as a relationship ages, you think you know everything about them. You anticipate them. You feel their pain. You get attached to a history where justice needs to intervene. And things get harder. What if we could tear all of that down? What if we could just enshrine ourselves in the mystery that each of us represents? Get rid of the categories. Find the love that is totally part and parcel of everything we are. Fish don't exist, but love absolutely does.
slowly start to build a beautiful city. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. We can build a beautiful city, not a city of angels, but finally a city of men. A city of men.
We will now receive an offering for the support of this religious community and its work in the world. You are invited to give generously and joyfully as you are willing and able. Online, you can make a secure donation by going to truu.org and clicking on the offering plate image at the bottom of the homepage. You can also mail your pledges to the address shown on the slide or put them in the offering plate as we pass it this morning. And as always, we are so grateful for your generosity.
From you I receive, to you I give. Together we share, and from this we live. From you I receive, to you I give. Together we share, and from this we live.
Thank you. Please remain seated for our closing hymn, Come and Go With Me. It's you.
This is a tough one. What will we make of our imagination? Thank you for sitting with me through a long reflection. I think it's just such a complicated question, and it is complicated for me to even begin to unravel. Part of what I do when I try to unravel my own categories, though, is to unravel this idea that there are evil men out there and good men, and that I am trying to find love in my heart for all, so that when they come, if they come with hate, I meet them with a different frequency, a different resonance. I think that's so essential. David Starr Jordan, I think, has something beautiful to say, and I'll just read a quote of his that reflects the idea that imagination is just raw power. How we use it is what matters. He writes, it is, and this is after the destruction of the San Francisco earthquake, it is the lesson of earthquake and fire that man cannot be shaken and cannot be burned. The houses he builds are houses of cards, but he stands outside of them and can build again. It is a wonderful thing to build a great city. More wonderful still is it to be a city, for a city is composed of men, and forever man must rise above his own creations. That which is in man is greater than all that he can do. This power is in us. It is glorious. As we find it, as we start to play the games together of creating a world we imagine that is new and fresh, not constrained, we have glorious, glorious power together. Thank you all for being on this journey with me. I look forward to seeing hopefully most, if not all of you next week. And I hope this week is absolutely beautiful for you all.
We will extinguish our chalice now with the words of Elizabeth Sell Jones. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fires of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Now please rise in body or spirit and join hands for our sending forth song, One World Home by Jimmy Byrne.
Joys and the griefs, the colors and beliefs, the sunlight shines upon us all the same. Open minds, loving hearts, helping hands, it's a start. One world home, one world home, one world home. Open minds, loving hearts, helping hands, it's a start. One world home.